Night mirror. It all started on an ordinary Tuesday evening, or so I thought. The kind of evening where you've already done all your chores and you're left with the dullness of a quiet home. I had moved into my grandmother's old house a few months ago, inheriting it after her passing. The place, though familiar, always seemed to hold its secrets just beneath the surface. The floorboards creaked, the windows groaned, and there was that perpetual musty smell you could never quite air out, no matter how hard you tried. It was on the attic that I found it, the mirror. It was tucked away beneath an old sheet, barely visible beneath a pile of forgotten boxes. I didn't think much of it at first. Just another old relic to collect dust. But as I dragged the thing down from the attic, the eerie sense of something being off crawled into my skin. It was a large, ornate mirror with intricate carvings along the frame. The glass itself was dull, cracked in a few places, but when I stood before it, something in me hesitated. The first night I placed it against the wall in my bedroom, I noticed nothing unusual. It was just a mirror, reflecting the room behind me as mirrors do. I brushed it off, though a part of me felt unsettled by the way it seemed to distort the shadows in the room, like the reflections were just a fraction too off. But that night, I fell asleep without giving it much thought. The second night, however, things changed. I woke up to the sound of soft scraping, like nails against glass. I sat up in bed, the sheets tangled around my legs. The sound was coming from the mirror. I turned to look, my heart pounding in my chest, but it wasn't the mirror I saw. No, it was something else. The reflection wasn't of my bedroom at all. The room in the mirror was dimly lit, a place I didn't recognize. It was dark and cold, the walls lined with old, peeling wallpaper. A window on the far side revealed a landscape that didn't belong to anywhere I knew, long, barren fields stretching out under a gray sky. And standing near the window was a figure. At first, I thought it was me, but as I squinted, the figure's features became clearer. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, staring directly at the mirror as if she could see me through it. Her eyes were hollow, black pools of emptiness. I couldn't move. My throat closed up. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. And then she smiled. But not a friendly smile. It was a twisted, painful grin, as though she were mocking me. I forced myself to look away, not daring to blink, but when I turned my gaze back to the reflection, it was just my room again. The mirror showed nothing unusual. Nothing out of place. But I couldn't shake the image of her face, her eyes following me. The third night was worse. Much worse. I don't know why I couldn't stop myself from looking into the mirror again. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the creeping sense of needing to understand what was happening. As soon as I turned off the lights and lay back down, I felt the same scraping sound against the glass. My body stiffened. The reflection was there again, but this time, the woman wasn't alone. Behind her, in the darkness, a figure stood. A man. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face hidden in shadow. The air grew colder, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. The woman in the reflection didn't smile this time. Instead, her lips moved, slowly, painfully, as though she were whispering something, but I couldn't hear it. The man behind her remained motionless, but his presence felt overwhelming. Like he was waiting for something. Waiting for me. I turned my back to the mirror, trying to ignore the fear gnawing at me. But sleep wouldn't come. I lay in the silence, trying to convince myself it was all just a trick of the mind, something my imagination was conjuring. But when I turned to look again, I saw that the man was closer. Closer to the woman, closer to the window, and closer to me. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the mirror, my breath ragged in my chest. The reflection was unchanged, but the room in the mirror felt real. The cold air seemed to seep through the glass, filling my room. I reached out, my hand trembling, my fingers just inches from the cold surface. It was at that moment that I saw it, the reflection of the woman's hand reaching out toward me. The feeling that washed over me was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was as if the world around me had shifted, leaving me stranded between two places. The warmth of my bedroom, the smell of the worn sheets, felt distant, unreal. The room in the mirror, the one I didn't know, the one I could never remember, felt alive. More alive than my own. The woman's hand was getting closer. She was coming for me. I couldn't tear myself away from the mirror. My breath caught in my throat, the pulse in my head thundering. I was paralyzed by the pull of whatever force was at work, the grip of something I couldn't see but could feel closing in around me. The man's shadow loomed larger, the woman's form growing more defined. But just as my fingers brushed against the cold glass, I snapped back. I fell backward, hitting the floor hard, gasping for air. The mirror was silent again. The reflection had returned to normal. But I knew it wasn't over. I could feel them still watching me. There was a moment of peace, a brief lull in the storm. The room felt calm. But I knew better. I had seen the woman's face too clearly now. I had seen the man's eyes, even though they were hidden in the darkness. And I knew that no matter how far I ran, no matter how many nights I spent avoiding the mirror, they would keep coming closer. Because the mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was a doorway. And they were waiting for me to cross it. I had no idea what they wanted, or what would happen if I didn't stop. But I couldn't just leave it behind. Couldn't just forget. The mirror had become a part of me. And now it was waiting for me to take the final step. And every night, the woman's face would be there, smiling. The question was no longer whether I would look, but when. The fourth night felt different. Maybe it was the weariness that had settled in my bones, the exhaustion from trying to sleep while that thing, whatever it was, stared back at me through the glass. Or maybe it was the creeping dread, the realization that I had been watching for days, unable to look away, unable to stop the pull. It was getting stronger, the feeling of someone, or something, reaching out from beyond the mirror. I couldn't escape it. It had burrowed under my skin, a constant weight on my chest that no amount of light or noise could push away. I didn't sleep that night. The minutes bled into hours, the night stretching endlessly before me, the ticking of the clock louder with each passing second. The air in the room felt different. Thicker. Heavier. I found myself staring at the mirror without meaning to, my gaze locked on the smooth surface as if it had some kind of magnetic force. I couldn't tear my eyes away. Then I saw it. At first, it was subtle, just a shift in the shadows in the corner of the room. But then it became clearer, sharper. The reflection wasn't the bedroom anymore. The room in the mirror had changed again. It was darker, colder. A dull, lifeless glow barely illuminated the walls, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally. The woman was there again, standing in the center of the room, but this time her eyes weren't hollow. They were different. Alive. The darkness around her seemed to pulse, as though she was drawing power from it. I didn't move. I couldn't. She was no longer looking at me, though. Her gaze was fixed on something else, a figure moving in the background. It was him. The man. His silhouette was tall, his presence overpowering. He wasn't as hidden as before, his face clearer now. I could see the sharpness of his jaw, the coldness in his eyes. There was something about him, something that sent a jolt of terror through my veins. And then, as if the glass had become a living thing, I felt it. A rush of cold air, not from the window, but from the mirror itself. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel my breath freezing in my chest. The woman moved. She walked closer to the window, her feet barely touching the ground. And then, she turned. Slowly, painfully, she turned her face toward me. This time, her smile was different. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't twisted. It was a grin full of hunger. Of need. She reached out, her hand extending towards me, her fingers curling into a silent invitation. The man behind her stayed still, but I could feel his eyes on me. It was as if they were both watching, waiting for me to make the next move. I wanted to scream. To run. But I couldn't. The mirror had me, wrapped in its grip like a vice. The woman's face, the man's shadow, they were pulling me into the glass, and I didn't know how much longer I could resist. I heard it then, the sound, soft at first, like a whisper brushing against my ear. "You're not supposed to be here," the voice said. It was low, a raspy whisper that made my blood run cold. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. The mirror stayed silent, but I could still feel them, both of them, lingering just beyond the surface, just beyond my reach. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Not now. Not when I knew they were waiting. The next day, I tried to act normal. I went about my routine, cleaned up around the house, even smiled at the neighbor who came by to drop off a package. But the weight of it, the weight of knowing something was watching, something was waiting for me to come back to the mirror, it never left. By evening, the air in my room felt thick again. I didn't even need to check the clock. I knew it was time. It was always time. I walked over to the mirror, my legs heavy, my body unwilling to move, but still, I went. The reflection shifted the moment I looked into it. The familiar bedroom was gone again. The darkness stretched beyond the glass. The woman was there, but now she was closer. Her hand was still reaching toward me, fingers outstretched, her smile widening, too wide, her teeth gleaming in the dim light. But it wasn't just her anymore. The man was there too. His figure loomed behind her, his eyes locked on mine. I could feel his gaze deep inside me, a suffocating presence that I couldn't escape. And then, he stepped forward. Slowly. Calculating. His shadow stretched, shifting across the room, closer and closer. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I felt a sudden jolt of panic, an overwhelming urge to run, to escape before it was too late. But my body wouldn't move. It was like my feet were glued to the floor, my mind trapped in the reflection. The man in the mirror, he was looking directly at me now, his eyes cold, unblinking. And then he smiled. It was not the woman's smile. It wasn't mocking, or hungry. It was something else. Something darker. And then I understood. The mirror was no longer just showing a reflection. It was showing a trap. A place I was being drawn into. A place where they waited for me to join them. Where I belonged. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the sound of the woman's whisper, soft, low, like the breath of a dead thing. "It's too late now. You're ours." The mirror went silent. But I didn't feel alone anymore. The only thing left to do was wait for the next night. And then, the cycle would begin again. The fifth night came too soon. The night that felt like it had been waiting for me, like it had been marked on a calendar long before I even realized what was happening. The room was darker now, quieter, as if the walls themselves had learned to hold their breath. There was no denying it anymore, I could feel it in the very air around me, thick and suffocating. They were there. I could feel their presence even before I stepped into the room. The mirror was calling to me, pulling me with an irresistible force. It wasn't even a question anymore whether or not I would go to it. My legs moved on their own, as though the glass had taken control of my body, leading me closer to its cold surface. I reached for it, my fingers trembling with a mixture of fear and curiosity. I didn't want to, but I had to. Something inside me told me I had no choice. As my fingers brushed against the cool frame, I felt the shift. The temperature in the room dropped, the air turned frigid, and the world around me became warped. The bedroom I had known, my safe place, was gone. The mirror was no longer reflecting my room, my life. Instead, it showed a place that seemed both familiar and alien. A dimly lit hallway, its walls covered in peeling wallpaper. The light flickered as if it was on the verge of dying, casting long shadows that crawled along the floor like living things. I didn't know why I was looking, but I couldn't look away. The woman was there again. She stood at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the light, her back to me. But she was different this time. The way she stood, her posture, her stance, was somehow more assertive. Like she knew I was watching. Like she was waiting. I wanted to look away. To run. But something in me, some instinct, drove me forward. I had to see. I had to know. As I stepped closer to the mirror, the hallway in the reflection seemed to stretch, its walls narrowing, pulling the distance between us shorter and shorter. I could feel my breath catch in my throat, my heart thumping harder with each passing second. She turned. Slowly. And for the first time, I saw her face in full. The same pale skin, the same dark eyes, but there was something new in her expression. Something that sent a chill down my spine. Her lips parted in a slow, deliberate smile, but it wasn't a smile of comfort. It wasn't warm or welcoming. It was a smile of knowing. A smile that made me feel like I was the prey, and she had been waiting for me. I didn't even realize I had started to move forward until I felt the cold air around me, the glass beginning to fog up as I leaned in closer. I couldn't stop. I couldn't even think. That was when I saw him. The man. The one who had always been lurking behind her, his shadow stretching like a dark stain across the room. He stepped into the light now, his figure looming just behind her. His eyes found mine instantly, pinning me with a cold, calculated gaze that made my skin crawl. He wasn't as far away as before. His face, once obscured by shadows, was now fully visible, and the coldness in his eyes was terrifying. He looked at me the way a predator looks at its prey, like he knew exactly what I was going to do. I wanted to scream. To run. But my voice had been stolen. My body was still moving toward the mirror, even though I didn't want it to. I couldn't stop. I reached out to touch the surface of the glass, my fingers pressing against it, but there was no reflection anymore. No cool surface. No barrier. Just darkness. I couldn't breathe. Then, the woman spoke. Her voice, low and soothing, filled my mind, not my ears. It didn't come from her lips, it was inside me, creeping into my thoughts. "You've been waiting," she whispered, her words curling around me like smoke. "We've been waiting. You're not afraid anymore, are you?" The question hung in the air, suffocating me. I wanted to pull away, but I couldn't. Her voice was like a drug, pulling me deeper into the void. The man stepped forward then, his shadow falling over her. He didn't speak, but I could feel the weight of his presence pressing in on me. He was closer now, so close that I could almost feel his breath, cold and sharp against my skin. And then I saw it. Something in the reflection shifted. The hallway I had been staring into, the one that had felt so real, so tangible, began to break apart. The walls twisted, the floor cracked open like a wound. The reflection blurred and distorted, like the mirror itself was alive. I couldn't look away, even as the edges of reality began to fray, even as the world around me unraveled. I saw them then. The people who had been trapped in the mirror, the ones whose faces had never been fully shown. They were there, their eyes locked on me, their hands reaching toward the glass. They were pulling at the edges, trying to get out, trying to drag me in. I stepped back, my body shaking with fear, but the mirror didn't let me go. It held me in its grip, pulling me closer, pulling me into that place where the shadows never ended. And then I heard the whisper again, louder now, more urgent. "You're ours," the woman said, her voice a growl in my mind. "You're one of us now." The glass trembled, the crack in the mirror growing wider, its edges sharp and jagged. I could feel the darkness spilling through the cracks, crawling into the room with me. It was everywhere now. I could see it, smell it, feel it. The man's shadow loomed over me, his hand outstretched, reaching for me, and I realized, with a sinking horror, that there was no escape. There never had been. And then the mirror shattered. The glass fell away like dust, shattering around me, but it didn't matter. The darkness had already consumed me. I was in it now, trapped in a world that wasn't mine, a world where I would never leave. Maybe I should have known. Maybe I should have listened when the whispers started. But it was too late now. The mirror had taken me,